One of the most compelling things about The Call of the World, according to my 8-year-old son, is the photograph of Mr. Graham campaigning near the Wellesley station, posing with a group of 3 punk youth sporting mohawks.
It's a good picture.
All 4 of them are relaxed and grinning. Yes, Mr. Graham does hang with a cool crowd, I concurred, but there's so much more to interest you about his book. I try to make my child politically savvy. It begins with a really fabulous story of his childhood in Vancouver. His home was very near UBC Press, though much better appointed, and the mysterious family secret that, like a golden spool, took decades to unravel. Much later, his appointment as Minister of Foreign Affairs coincided with the dramatic countdown to the American invasion of Iraq and its aftermath. Then, his term as Minister of National Defence put him again at the centre of Canada's military involvement, this time in Afghanistan. Throughout, we travel with Mr. Graham from the Arctic to South America to West Africa, participating in some of the most far-reaching decisions in recent Canadian political history. And with that, my junior audience was hooked, or remained hooked, I should say. But I couldn't stop thinking of what initially attracted him to this book, for it's something I noticed too as soon as I picked up the manuscript. I was one of its early editors. Mr. Graham wants to communicate intergenerationally, to know what is on the minds of young people, to hear the issues they have and respond to them, and to impart the notion that politics is a noble calling. This is a rare quality in a person, a politician, and a writer. The Call of the World is the inaugural publication under UBC Press's trade imprint, On Point Press. We owe its place on our list to the behind-the-scenes work of John English and Bob Bothwell, editors of the C.D. Howe series in Canadian political history in which it appears. On behalf of the press, I'd also like to thank Ron Graham and Joe Dunlop, who were instrumental in the preparation of the manuscript, and Dilys Williams, who's kept all parties marching to the same beat since publication. I'd like to thank the Canadian International Council for their contribution to tonight's event, and also Keith Martin and Jennifer Chilinsky. Most of all, I would like to thank Bill Graham for entrusting us with his splendid memoirs. And now, I have the very great pleasure of introducing Professor Mayo Moran, Provost and Vice Chancellor of Trinity College, who I would also like to thank for hosting tonight's events. Like Bill Graham, she is a scholar of the law and legal theory, whose work probes the legal limits and possibilities of redressing historic wrongdoing and addressing equality. Thank you very much.
Hello, everyone. Welcome, dear Chancellor.
Well,
it's good to have you in the hot seat for a change.
Let's change. And
A
I'll
little
ask you
bit
questions.
nervous, yes. So it really is a great honor to be here to talk about some of the themes in your wonderful book, The Call of the World. Some people have described the response to this book such that they're considering you the new Adele. I don't know how you feel about that. I'm not sure that's the comparison you would pick.
No, not necessarily, but I do remember somebody wanted to have didn't they want to have a referendum to change Mr. Day's name to Doris?
Doris, yes, exactly.
That's similar kind of.
Well, rather than, we normally start these out with a biography, but since so much of this book is the story of your life, I thought that we would just jump right in, because I think most people here are aware of much of the sort of general biography, your time at UCC, of course your time at this wonderful institution, Trinity College, another one across the way, UT Law School, and then the doctorate you did in law in Paris. But I want to focus on some other themes that I think will be of particular interest to this audience. And that is because really in this book, you are playing a part in the great events, not only of the life of this nation, but I think the events that also shaped our collective history over the past couple of decades. So that's what I'd like to focus on. I want to start with your running for office. And I was very interested, as Emily mentioned, the story of Bill's early life is fantastic. If you open the book, this is what it says in the very first lines. I don't know where I was born. I can't even be certain when, which makes it difficult to get an accurate horoscope. So from the story of your...
It's good, my wife says to me, that's not really for you.
You're the other one.
Exactly.
That's right. So I think we know you've had this very sort of glamorous early life, many siblings, mysterious parentage, wonderful house at UBC, an old Land Rover on your way to Afghanistan. I felt, and I'm sure other readers may have felt as well, that I might have been reading Nancy Mitford or maybe sometimes Monty Python. There's even Captain Wooten Wooten, who talks through a black Labrador. I mean, it really is the stuff of great fiction. But then it seems that things came very easy to you in your early life. You had a very successful academic career, a gold medalist at the Faculty of Law, which Paul Martin, his classmate, didn't really appreciate. And then a great career following that in international law and as a professor. And then you decided to run for politics. And politics seems to have been a very different story in a way. I was struck when I was reading the story of your entrance into politics, of how hard it was, how long it took, 3 tries before you got elected, and how much it really was a whole family affair. Absolutely. And so I think people would be very interested to hear what motivated you, not just to start, but to keep going in the way that you did.
Well, I think what motivated me very much was perhaps growing up as I did, being exposed to a lot of people in public life, studying history here at Trinity. I mean, you can't really do history, but this is, I think, when you think back history, we were very fortunate, as you said, really, and maybe it wasn't natural when going to politics, partly because we went to history, then, life in those days was so much more simple than it is for the young graduates today. I walked across Philosopher's Walk and into the law school. There was no, the competition to get in there wasn't that difficult. One went there, and then we got a job at the end of that and went downtown and sort of worked. But for me, what I did discover, though, in my practice, and I was very fortunate to have a practice at Fasken and Calvin. Some of my former partners are here in the room with me. We had a very dynamic firm in those days. It was a colorful firm. Its leading litigation lawyer was a man by the name of Walter Williston, who bordered on the insane, but was brilliant, and who just about drove us all crazy, but was really a great litigation lawyer. And the firm itself allowed a lot of latitude. So when because I'd graduated and with the top of the class, but also had an interest in international affairs, the firm encouraged me. In fact, when I went to Paris, the firm paid me a salary as a junior to live in Paris, and I did some work for the firm when I was there, which was really remarkable. And that encouraged me to be involved. I see
students looking around, looking rather surprised.
I know. If there are any young law students here, give it a try, but it's a lot trickier today. They expect a lot more work for a lot less pay. But it was, I did, however, get involved in a lot of international affairs quite early on, and when the firm had an international issue, it often brought it to me and said, you speak French, here, we'll get you involved in this. And so over time, I started going to Africa, I started going to the Middle East, I started doing a lot of international practice for the firm, and I came to really, really strongly believe that Canada was getting more and more integrated into the world. And looking at politics, I was always interested. I remember my first first really dramatic political moment was in Paris when I was doing my doctorate, and Pierre Trudeau came to the school there, and Pierre was then the Minister of Justice, and he was just about to run to be leader, and we were all so excited. And I was the only Anglophone there; everybody else was a Francophone, But it was very dramatic, and I thought, politics is amazing. When I told my father that I might go into politics, he said, "Oh, William, you wouldn't want to do that. That's very scummy business." But I sort of laughed that he said that, because we used to have often politicians at the house, and we'd have famous editors of newspapers would come, and they all talked politics. But it was all right to talk politics, but it wasn't all right to do it. That was for other people. But for me, I just somehow came to this conclusion that the international dimension was very important, that it was not much paid attention to in our national politics, and I thought I'd really like to get elected to change that. Now, that may seem to you as a bit nutty in a way, as an ambition to start something, and John Campion, who's here, and some of my other friends, and I don't know if Tom Wilson's here, but I know that, when I originally announced that I was going to do this, they all said, "You're crazy," and then John said, "Oh, well, let's give it a try," and in fact, he and I went to lunch with, it was quite funny, with some people I was invited by the leaders of then the Rosedale riding, it was called, and the executive phoned me up and they said, "Bill, we'd like to have lunch with you. We'd like to talk to you about but maybe running in the riding." So I said, "Oh, okay, I'll come down and have lunch with you." So they said, "You'd be a perfect guy, you're bilingual, you can do this." And I said, "Oh yeah, I'm quite interested actually." So I said, "Well, if I run, you'll be supporting me." "Well, no, actually, I'll be supporting Jerry Doucette." I said, "Who's Jerry Doucette?" "Well, he's in Ottawa and he wants to run in the riding. I'll be supporting him." "Well, what about you? Would you support me?" No, I'm supporting Jerry Doucette." So I went around and they were all supporting Jerry Doucette. So I said, "Let's get this straight. You want me to run, but you're all supporting somebody else. Do I get the impression I'm being a bit of a patsy here? That create a horse race, first get a little interest going?" And they sort of said, "Well, it would help the riding if we got some interest going." So Campy and I went home and had a few whiskeys and said, "To hell with them," and we ran and won the nomination against Jerry Doucette, and that was the end of that. After that, and it was a big nomination. We had 1,500 people down at the Waterfront Hotel, and it was one of the biggest nomination meetings of its day, wasn't it, John? It was a bit of a riot, actually. We had fun. It was a lot of fun, and then I came to learn, really, of course, that politics. I had this romantic dream about the international dimension, and that remained my dream even when I got into the House, and everybody used to tease me about it. But I was the chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committee, so that sort of legitimated it. But I learned, of course, that all politics is local, and ultimately, if you have the most elaborate international ambitions, they will come to nothing unless you can get elected locally, and you have to do what's necessary to get elected locally.
Well, and I think that's one of the things that's really a compelling story in the book, and Tom Wilson, who I know is here, plays a role in this. I like, as a former professor, I have to say, I find it poignant. At a relatively early moment, you have a full room, and you give what you think is a magnificent speech, and I'm sure it was.
It was.
It was fantastic. And you, at the end of it, you say to Tom, "Wasn't that great? That was fantastic." And Tom, the strategist, says, "Well, look at how many people actually picked up membership forms, 2 people."
Yeah.
And so the transition from being a professor, we, of course, as professors, we deal more in complexity than in necessarily being very concise. And so sometimes I think that the challenge of moving from that world into the political world must have been quite a significant one.
Yeah, it was. As you say, but I'll tell you something about politics is there's an amazing number of people who are quite good at politics that astound me because they really don't seem to like people, which is kind of weird in a way. But I liked people. Now, it's true my son Patrick used to say, "I'm not very good on names, so I know it." So that was not helpful. But I also like dogs. And people like you if you like their pets. So I made a point of making sure that I said, well, what race is that dog? Oh, that's a very fine animal. You see, you make friends with the dogs. You get to know the people behind them, and you get to know the people behind the pets. So there's a way in which, if you have a certain empathy, and you really do genuinely like people, it sort of stirs your curiosity. And the funny thing for me was, of course, everybody said, oh, well, Bill, this is a bit crazy. You're this kind of sports-jacketed law professor, and you're going to go down to Regent Park in St. Jamestown, and you're going to knock on doors down there, and those people are going to pay any attention to you. That's ridiculous. And I sort of thought myself, well, it is a bit ridiculous when you think of it, because there's a big gap. And in fact, Rosedale riding for me was a little bit like the world. I mean, it was like the first world and the third world. Which, by the way, I thought was a wonderful thing. I think it's a wonderful thing in our country that we don't have ridings that are so rigged that everybody lives in them as the same people that talk to each other and just do exactly the same things. I think it's important to have constituencies which cross over boundaries. And Rosedale was amazing. We had very wealthy people in the north, and then you had St. Jamestown, and particularly Regent Park, where you had some of the low-income people, many immigrants, and everybody said, "Oh, well, how are you going to win the riding? You're never going to fit in there." And particularly all this international shtick, where's that going to go? And somebody even said to me one day, I mentioned in a speech I'd taken a taxi somewhere, and a lady in Rosedale said, "But don't talk about taking taxis. I mean, people won't understand that you're." I said, "You don't understand. People south of Bloor Street take taxis all the time. They can't afford cars. They all use taxis. Real people use taxis." It's funny the conceptions that people have. And I started to overcome these conceptions. Well, you're an international. What do they care? Well, they care. It's always what does somebody else think. What do they care about international? I said, well, I'll tell you something. They all come from somewhere else. They are all very interested in international. We had 7,000 Tamils lived in Toronto Centre when I first ran. They were very interested in what was happening in Sri Lanka. We had a large Filipino population. We had the whole world, 67 different languages are spoken in St. Jamestown alone. I mean, I was totally at home when I got down there and started talking to people about problems of their countries, where they came from. And something amazing, Mayo? When I became the foreign minister, one of the most effective kind of shticks, if you could call it that, I mean, it's a sloppy expression, that I had when I was dealing with other foreign ministers, and you're having a difficult conversation or about something. Say the Chinese foreign minister, you're talking about human rights or issues which sometimes could be awkward, and people would say, you don't want to sound lecturing, but at the same time you're raising issues that are important. I used to always say, I have a constituent that comes from your country, and they want me to be their representative to build a better world for them and a better country. And I hope that's your ambition as well, because you would appreciate it if you ever want to come to my riding, and you will meet somebody from your country, and they will tell you what it's like and how we can work on a better world together. It was a wonderful way, to talk to other foreign ministers and make them say, we've got something in common. So all these things are really, in the end, politics, but they're about people and building relations with people and making people understand you. And that I was happy doing that. I was very happy doing that.
I think that came across so strongly in the book. First of all, the importance of the human connection.
This is what George Bush used to call a telephone infraction master. He was very stern on it and used to fine his people $5.
He's trying to
American dollars, master.
The human touch and your belief in human relationships really is the foundation of everything from, constituency level politics to sort of the great affairs of state is definitely something that comes across so strongly in the book, and I think that that's something where, is possible to see that you did build a relationship with this very, very diverse constituency. In fact, in the book, you say that you were actually much more at home south of Bloor and much more welcomed often than you were north of Bloor.
Well, there were several reasons for that. I would say certainly in the first two elections I ran, I probably only got 15 or 20% of the vote north of Bloor Street, whereas because the people there tended to be more conservative. However, as Donald MacDonald used to say to me, and he'd been the member there for a long time, he'd say, now, Bill, when the master of the house throws you off the front porch, go round to the back and talk to his wife, because she probably votes Liberal. So, you learn that, it's not necessarily the way it seems. But Rosedale certainly itself tended to be much more of a conservative bent. I'd like to think that when I finally left, we were winning all the polls north of Bloor Street as well, and so that was a total change. But in the early times, of course, the first election I ran in, again, I ran against David Crombie, and of course, David Crombie won every poll. I was totally wiped out, legitimately so, because he was a wonderful candidate and he's a wonderful human being. So I learned then that you think you're doing well, but I lost the election before the polls had been closed by 5 minutes.
But it must have been a hard decision the third time. So the first time running, and then the second time, but the third time. I think we're all very, very grateful you decided to do that third time. But I can imagine that was hard to, go. It was close the second time, but it must have been hard to say I'm going to go once more into the breach.
Second election was that was probably the lowest point of my life when I realized, because what happened in the second election was I won by about 300 votes on the night of the election, and the CBC said I was the MP, and the next day they counted the absentee ballots, and I lost by 60 votes. So I went from winning on the night to losing the next day. And the next day I went to the law school to teach my course. The students said, "You're back here? I thought you were supposed to be elected to Parliament." So thanks a lot, guys. But anyway, it was, and Katie, we were pretty bruised after that experience. But I remember a wonderful French constituent of mine. She was a real pepperpot, and I forget what she took me out for a drink, and she says, "Now, Bill, il y a une expression française, jamais deux sans trois." So I said, okay, jamais deux sans trois. We'll give it one more try.
Well, we're all very glad you did.
Well, and of course, Mr. Chrétien being the leader at that changed everything, and that was, of course, a totally different election. And I must say, if we can say that, as Canadians, really, when you think of it, we live in a country. Look at the United States. There's virtually no change in the Congress. The way they've structured their ridings, the way they've structured the system. Of the 300 seats or whatever it is, only about 20 or 25 are at play at any one election. It's really a crazy system. In our country, we do get. Some people don't believe, but we get these huge sweeps. Mulroney had a vast majority in the House of Commons, and they went down to 3 seats or 4 seats. We had a big majority, and dropped down, and then you get these enormous swift and changes in our country. And I think it's a good thing. It gets new people in. It doesn't have that kind of continuity that's a result of, I think, of having constituencies that are so structured that it's always the same people that are voting for the same people.
Well, you did get elected.
I got elected.
Finally, thankfully. And then there's so much in the book, and I urge people to read it. But I would like to ask you some questions, just to talk to this audience a little bit, about how your background and understanding of international law ended up influencing some of what you did. And in particular, I'm going to just ask you something first, because Caesar Wright, the dean of U of T Law School at the time, Caesar, that tells you something. When Bill said to him,
could have been Brutus, but anyway.
Yeah, right. Yeah, I know. Yeah, very good. Could have. When Bill told him that he was planning on doing international law, Caesar Wright said, "Why on earth would you do international law? It's a waste of time. It's nothing more than political posturing." And of course, Bill did go on to do international law and worked on some very famous cases. For international law geeks in the room, Barcelona Traction is sort of where it's all at. But then during the aftermath of 9/11 and in the decisions around Iraq, once you became foreign minister, suddenly and strangely, international law is actually at the center of these debates. And at the center, of course, of your relationship with Colin Powell and Jack Straw and others. And can you talk a bit about how you think your background in international law influenced your thinking in those days?
Yeah, I think that's a very good question, because it certainly did influence, and I think it influenced, as having done my doctorate in Paris, I don't know, Jesse Fliss, an old colleague of mine from the House of Commons, is here, but I think it probably influenced the credibility that I had amongst my colleagues in the House, the fact that I was known as an international law lawyer, and so when I was appointed chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committee, people say this guy has a certain gravitas. I mean, there were other international lawyers in the House, but there was a group of us, but you had some expertise in the material. So to begin with, the area in which I was really interested in, I had some expertise. And the law school at the time, I mean, we laughed about Caesar, but he was a great teacher and a great influence of the development of law in Ontario. And he and Bora Laskin, and Bora was Bora was not a wonderful teacher, but he was a wonderful person, an extraordinary academic, and you just admired him, and we'd go in and talk to him, and his door was always open, and he was a remarkable individual, and we were lucky enough to have some really fabulous teachers, and they were inspirational. They definitely did not, at that time, international law and conflicts of laws, as it was known, were not really that respected as studies, largely because we hadn't integrated in the world to the degree to which we're now integrated. This was before the big trade deals, the WTO and things like that. They were very much the embryonic thing of the GATT. A lot of the international legal framework was still at quite an embryonic age in 1960. And I was fortunate enough to teach law at a time when it was developing and when you could actually feel it. And when Frank Iacobucci phoned me up when I was at Faskins and said, "Bill, would you come and teach?" I said, "Why would you ask me?" He said, "Because we at the law school need to improve the éventail of our international law offerings. We're lacking in that area, and the students are saying the world is being integrated. Now, it's not good enough to just know the law of Ontario anymore, because I want to go to the States, and there's the security exchange laws. There's so much things that we're integrating, and will you come and help us kind of broaden the scope of our international offerings?" And you've actually done it. There are not that many people have practiced it, so you've had the opportunity of practicing. Will you come in? So I went and did that. And in that period of time, even those 12 years that I taught, the law of the sea came together. That was a huge development. And Canada was at the center of that. And that's another thing. Canada was at the center of so many of these international law developments, because as a country, we believe that we have to create a world in which there are legal obligations amongst states that in order for them to behave. And if we don't have that, we're not going to have a world that's going to be manageable. I mean, the young generation that are coming up now, I mean, they're looking at COP21 in Paris and global warming, and they're saying COP21 says it's legally binding. I mean, what does that mean? I mean, 1961, no international agreement would have said it was legally binding. That was far too dangerous a thing. States wouldn't sign on to something of that nature. They wouldn't have bound themselves to. So what does this mean? I mean, Mayo, this is a huge thing. So when you think of it, in our lifetime, I mean, as I say, the law of the sea, the Landmines Convention that we were a part of when we were in Parliament, the International Criminal Court. I was challenged by somebody the other day about, the International Criminal Court, what's that? That's international palaver, blah, blah, blah. I said, the International Criminal Court is part of the law of Canada. It was adopted into the criminal code. When our soldiers go abroad, they're not just being governed by international law rules, they're being governed by domestic Canadian criminal law if they misbehave. And they can be taken. And we have a very strong ethic and very strong legal ethic within our armed forces. So, and I don't think that would have been true in 1961. Yeah. So international humanitarian law, as I say, in the area of trade and in the area of international commerce, the legal developments have been incredible. I used to laugh. I was instrumental in helping draft a law. It was the law of international commercial arbitration. I spent years working on that. And, that's that was adopted by the province of Ontario. And people say, oh, well, you know, Ontario is all common law. But the International Law of Arbitration, which is a part of Ontario law, is civil law, it's Soviet law, it's Chinese law. It's got all sorts of stuff in there that totally unfamiliar to Ontario law. And the same would be true of our bills of exchange, a whole lot of other bills. So it's a new world.
We have some international law professors right here in the front row. But absolutely, there's been a huge shift in the relation of law and legal obligations to politics, and domestic and international. And certainly, I think a very fascinating chapter in the book is the one that, you know, the unwilling, the chapter about Iraq and the UN resolution 1441 and all the discussions around that and the legality. Can you talk a little bit about how you know, your role in that, and how, because you were very much pushing for a world that was more regulated by law, even in the use of force, which could be considered the area where law is least likely to be able to regulate.
Well, that's true. That's absolutely right. But I see Tanya here about the responsibility to protect doctrine. I mean, she's one of the great advocates of the responsibility of protect doctrine. You'll recall, for the use of force. Now, when we came to Libya, David Cameron said it's the right thing to do and it's the legal thing to do. And Mr. Obama, when he was structuring what the reaction would be, made sure that he got a Security Council resolution to make sure that he could say, this is a legal intervention we're making. It's not just a political intervention. So as that great book on law and war says, you know, law is really the language of power that empowers the politicians to do certain things. So international law now is such that it gives credibility to political actions. So when we came to the question of the intervention in Iraq, the discussion around the issue as to whether or not the original Security Council resolution authorized the use of force without the requirement of a second resolution became an extraordinarily important issue. And I remember talking to Jack Straw about it a lot when we were at the Prague.
Also a lawyer.
Yeah, also a lawyer. and at the Prague conference. And I mean, you know, you do these things in funny places. That's the other fun thing about international. You end up, you know, having drinks with Colin Powell and talking about it, or you're down in the Bahamas, or you're down at a conference and you're having dinner and everybody's laughing and drinking, and then you get into a serious conversation. In this particular case, it was in the gym in the morning. Jack and I were down there exercising. I noticed Jack had his bodyguard with him. I didn't have a bodyguard, but actually, that's not entirely true. I do tell in the book that at those international conferences, one normally had to have a bodyguard, largely to protect you against the American bodyguards, because they sort of pushed everybody around. And so first time I went to an international conference, they said, "Oh, these are your two police officers." And I said, "I don't need a police officer. No one's going to." "Oh no, you will. When you see when you see Powell coming with all his thugs, you'll need somebody to push back." So anyway, so we had our thugs and they had their thugs. But no, Jack and I got talking about this, and we had a really in-depth international law discussion about that. And you'll recall, and of course now in England today, for those of you that are following this, there's a commission there. There's actually, I think that the reputation of the Blair government has been totally destroyed by virtue of the fact that he hid what his Advocate General's conclusions were about the legality of going to Iraq from his own cabinet, and he forced his Advocate General to Attorney General to change the opinion in a way that was highly dubious, and as a result, it destroyed the credibility of what he did. And I think that Tony Blair's place in history will be forever destroyed to some extent because of what he did in Iraq and the way in which it was done. And it's all coming to light today that part of that was the legal dimension to this, and that there were people in their Foreign Office who resigned. And who wrote opinions saying this is illegal. And the chief of the defense staff, because they're signatories to the International Criminal Court, said, "I'm not going to go to war on a tenuous legal opinion because I'll end up going to jail. I'm not going to end up in The Hague along with Milosevic and the rest of them for war crimes." So this is not, that was not the position it would have been 20 years ago. I mean, we live in a very different world, Mayo, now when it comes to that. That's why the Americans had been so strong about trying to prevent the International Criminal Court, from coming to fruition, because they're so worried about how that'll inhibit one's ability to do these things.
In fact, it's interesting in that section of the book you talk about how all of you are trying to a certain extent to protect Colin Powell from the crazies that were around.
Oh, for sure. No, I mean, everybody, all the other foreign ministers, exactly. Joschka Fischer, all of us, we all were great admirers of Colin, and said, well, here was Colin, and he was being gradually isolated by largely Rumsfeld and Cheney and the people around that who were the big advocates, Wolfowitz and others, who were the advocates of the action in Iraq. So we've in the end, of course, he did what he did, but one felt that he was the strong voice. In the end, I think the decision was made, and I remember a conversation I recorded in the book where he said, well, unless something's done by a certain date, it's not going to be any use anyway. And at that point, the decision had been made, and the military decision had been made, and was all, full speed ahead and damn the torpedoes.
Let's switch gears a little. Something else I wanted to ask to just talk about a little bit more that I think will be of great interest is not so much international but domestic, and that's your relationship with Paul Martin. You were, of course, classmates at U of T Law. As I said, Paul always said that he got the C's and Bill got the gold medal.
But we always said that, what was it, the guys that get the A's teach, and the guys that get the C's do well, or
make
whatever.
All the money. That's what
Seems
they
to
say.
be.
Exactly.
Careful, a lot of professors in here. We better be careful what we say.
And so you and Paul, of course, knew each other from law school, and then you went on, of course, to serve together in the Chrétien government, both as ministers, but then at a certain point, obviously, the rivalry for leadership between Paul Martin's camp and Chrétien became very open, so open that it was obviously in the public eye. And you deal with this very elegantly, I must say, in the book. You're very sort of gentle about what it must have been like for you to be both a friend, I know not, a bestie necessarily, but a good friend of Paul Martin, but also a very loyal minister to Prime Minister Chrétien. And can you talk a little bit about how you navigated those waters in that period that was very tricky?
Sort of like a submarine, maybe? Navigating.
That sounds like a good place to be.
Well below the surface. Well, actually, it was one of my great regrets, actually. I did not go into the cabinet until quite late, in Mr. Chrétien's administration, as you know. And Paul left shortly after. I went in January, and I think Paul left the cabinet in March. So I didn't really serve in the cabinet much with Paul. And our parliamentary career, Jesse, there may be some other MPs here that have spent time. There is quite a distinction between the role of a minister and backbenchers, or whatever you want to call us. And he was so busy as finance minister that one didn't really have an opportunity to, bend a friendship in a way that one might have. I remember one night he took me out on my birthday. We went over across to Hull and perhaps spent too much time and too many bottles of wine there. Maybe, so we would see each other. But he didn't have a lot of time for social life. We didn't have a lot of time for social life. Politics is crazy. People think that it's. Well, I see some members of the provincial legislature here. It's the same. You're just busy from morning to night, and you're kind of doing your own thing from a narrow way. So you don't get a lot of time for personal relationships, and I think that's one of the, often family and others suffer as a result of it. But so I didn't, spend a lot of time with Paul when he was finance minister. He was busy, and And when I went into cabinet, then, as I say, he left shortly thereafter. I was always a tremendous admirer of his, and I made it clear to Mr. Chrétien that I would be supporting Paul when the time came. But Mr. Chrétien, when he was thinking about running again for another term, then started asking people, you know, well, where are you? And I remember a meeting of the Ontario cabinet, and he wasn't, Mr. Chrétien wasn't there, but we were all asked, you know, where are you? And one of my colleagues, the agriculture minister, said, well, my riding association is pretty well all committed to Mr. Martin. I mean, nobody had been out campaigning for Mr. Chrétien, so the riding association was, and I said, that's the same for me, and others were critical of it, but most of the cabinet ministers held up their hand and said, yeah, we've been, you know, Mr. Martin's been campaigning for this and at the party level, and I think at that point the cake was pretty well baked. So I think in the end, and Mr. Chrétien took me, I tell it in the story, took me to lunch one day and said, you know, where are you? What are you doing? And I said to him, and I said to Paul, I said, you appointed me as your minister. My first loyalty is to you. You're the prime minister. But I'm not saying that, but when you decided to go, then I'm free to support whoever I want to support. And he said, well, that's fair game. But I said, until you're there, you're the leader and I support you. And I told Paul that, and Paul said, well, I quite respect that. So Paul had no trouble with that.
When you look back at it's an interesting, I imagine you were dodging a lot of conversations during that period because, of course, as you say, people were trying to sign folks up and get
well, crazy misunderstandings took place. There was somebody phoned me up and said, would you come to a meeting at the airport about something? And as it turned out, it was on a Saturday and I was busy and didn't go. And then the next day in the press, this meeting was, I don't know if you remember this one, Jesse, but this meeting was portrayed as being a night of the long knives when a group of people were bringing together to stab Chrétien in the back. And I might have gone to it if I'd been around. I didn't, it just happened. Fortunately, I was busy. You didn't know. So the whole thing is crazy. You get sucked into the craziest things without any forethought, and your whole career goes up in smoke because you're associated with people you didn't know what they were up to,
Yeah.
You're right.
Dangerous. One reads the book, and as I say, you think it's a time when all your skills of diplomacy were probably necessary. When you look back on that period,
like diplomacy, as in someone who lies for his country, sort of thing.
No comment. When you look back on that period, you say that you feel, and I think there are lots of people who think that Paul Martin would have been a fabulous prime minister, but it never turned out obviously quite the way he had hoped. What's the thing you would change about how that all unfolded?
I think for me the litmus test is the financial update or the statement of principles that was put in the House by Paul and by Ralph Goodale in November of when did we
2003 maybe?
No, 2000 was up the Martin government would have been 2005, I guess it was 2005. Yes, because we lost the election in January of 2006, and that principle laid out the principle, and this is where I think is an indication of Prime Minister Martin's leadership. A city's agenda which would have given tax revenues to the city, a commitment to childcare, early learning and childcare, which is extremely important. The Kelowna Accords for the Aboriginal peoples of Canada. Now, those are three elements of that. There were more in that. But those were the type of thing that he was committed to. And you see that in his present life as a subsequent prime minister. He's been amazing what he's focused on. So those are the type of thing. And of course, there may be some people in the room who are NDP. And I will say I was a great admirer of Jack's. I particularly admired the way he managed what he was doing in Quebec. I used to tease him and say, what are you doing down in Quebec, Jack? But for him to have pulled the plug on that and caused the election basically meant that those major issues never came into power. They would have if we'd been left in power for another 6 months. and it meant that we got the Harper administration as a result. So that's politics.
Yeah.
And that's what can happen. But I think that's the illustration of where Paul was great. The problem that his administration had was he only had that 6 months to be prime minister when he had a majority. Everybody said, you have to get your own government, you've got to have your own election, you have to be your own man. So we called the election in June, and we came back as a minority. And the day after we were a minority, every single moment of your life was, what do we do here to avoid an election? How do we avoid this problem? How do we avoid that problem? It was no longer a question of governing to achieve things. It was a question of governing to survive. And that's not a very healthy way to go about doing things. So that was the last part of the administration. And I can remember sitting in cabinet and we'd talk about what we had to do and the big issues, but the one person that one listened to the most was the House leader, who talked about what was coming up the next week and what the votes were going to be and will we win this one or lose that one. And that was the total and utter preoccupation of the government of the day. And I think that was unfortunate.
Yeah.
But that's the nature. So people who like minority governments are generally those who haven't been around or actually had to exercise power. Because I have to tell you, a minority government's great if you want to wreck the place, but it's pretty hard to get something done.
Well, the first time I met you when I was dean, you were actually the leader of the official opposition.
But that's another thing you don't want to do.
I remember you saying it's the worst job in the world.
Yeah, well, John Tory agrees with me, and he's done it too. So this is not something any students in the room thinking of politics. That's one to avoid, I promise you.
So we only have a few minutes left, and I'm going to ask you just a couple of kind of larger reflection questions. So when you look back on this really remarkable career in politics, if you could change one thing, what would you change?
Oh, Lord. I'd change my age. Go back 25 years. No, I can remember Alan McEachin, to be younger, but Alan McEachin, we were in caucus, and all the senators had to resign at 75. So everyone was saying, oh, Mr. McEachin, this is terrible, you're going to leave the House, you won't be there. Oh, he looked around the room and he said, I can always run for the House of Commons. There's no limit there. And everybody's thinking, oh my God, if he runs in my seat, I'm dead, So I really, the one thing I would have loved to have had another 2 years, say, as Minister of National Defense. I mean, I just had got it going. I would have loved to have had another year as Minister of Foreign Affairs. I had 2 years in each one of those posts. It's not long enough to really make a mark in any way. It's long enough to get the files. It's long enough to do something, but it's not long enough to make a significant impact on the portfolio. In Foreign Affairs, I was there during those critical moments, as you said, particularly about Iraq. So I was able to supplement what Mr. Chrétien was doing, and I think I was helpful in that respect. And in national defense, I was able to get us an enormously important budgetary increase because we had ignored the forces for such a long time. But then that budgetary increase was to some extent to enable us to be more active in the world, in the international sphere of the world, and we lost the election, and somebody else carried out those responsibilities. So I regret that I didn't have more time.
And in terms of what you're most proud of, what are you most proud of?
Oh, wow. I think, I really think, probably when Mr. Chrétien stood in the House and said, we are not going to Iraq, that was a moment which I think all Canadians were very proud of. And I think when we stood in the House and we voted in favor of measures over the years which respected the rights of Canadians as gay and lesbian people, that we were able to say we have created a system where in our society, our charter actually says that we will not discriminate, but we've created a legal system and a political system which does that, and we have the support of the population. I mean, that final bill on the gay marriage bill was probably one of the most emotional and remarkable things one could imagine, and I consider it a great achievement in my life.
Just one of the reasons we're so proud of you, Mr. Chancellor.
Well, thank you very much.
So we now have a few minutes for questions. There are microphones, and so if people would like to ask questions, we invite you to come and do so.
Whoop.
I look forward to reading your book. Going back to your official period when you were Minister of Foreign Affairs and Defense, projecting to the present time, in lieu of your previous comments on legality, morality, international human rights issues in the world, how would you react to the present government's intention to sell weapons to Saudi Arabia?
Well, I think that's it's a very good question, and I noticed my great friend that I admire a great deal, Bloor, has been critical of it. I think that the present government, if I understand where they come from, would not have made that decision and not have made that sale had they been in power at the time. But to take an agreement of that nature and say now we're going to rip it up would be to basically put Canada in the position of saying you can't be trusted as a commercial partner in the world. And I think that would, the consequence of that would be, I think, very unfavorable for Canada. So I would not, I support the present government on what they've decided to do. But if we'd been in a position with, would we make that sale, I would have been first in line to say, no, we shouldn't make it. But it's a different position to be put in as to whether or not you make it, whether you would make it, as opposed to whether you will live up to the obligations of previous governments of Canada. If we are in a position of every time you change your government, you can rip up the international treaties or agreements you've entered into, I think we're living in a very problematic world.
Yes.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Mr. Graham. Next year is Canada's 150th birthday, the sesquicentennial. And so I have a two-part question for you about that. One is, what nation-building milestones would you like to see Canada ideally achieve by the end of next year? And secondly, how would you like to see the country celebrate the sesquicentennial? We are a relatively new country. Singapore had its 50th in 2015, did a number of remarkable things.
Right.
So I'm interested to know how you feel we should be preparing for the sesquicentennial.
Well, that's really, the latter question I've never given any thought to. I wouldn't like to just sort of answer without that, because I think that's a very important point, because the nature of celebrations you create are going to be a reflection of your priorities as a country. So I think that's quite would require some serious thought. But going back to your first question, I really think that in terms of international human rights, in terms of where we stand as a country, I think that what we are presently trying to achieve in terms of justice for the Aboriginal peoples of the Canada at this time is absolutely fundamental to what we stand for as a country. I think
that's domestic.
That is
about international.
Yes, well, but I see that as an international as well as domestic, because in my time, I worked very closely with many of the Aboriginal leaders, and they were at that time at the United Nations developing an international framework for that. And so then going to the international framework, I would say that the next thing I would hope we would be able to do is to make a constructive contribution towards the development of a comprehensive and effective international addressing of the climate change issue, because that is something that is a threat to the security of the planet and the well-being of so many people around the world. And I really feel that my biggest criticism, or one of the criticisms I had of the Harper government, was the failure for Canada to do what it's always been able to do, which is to help build international institutions so they can make a more secure world. And that's an international institution that the future generations in this room better well see built, or we're going to be in real trouble. So, although if I had to pick two things, those are the two things I'd pick.
Thank you.
Okay, Dr. Graham, you entered cabinet relatively late because there were too many Torontonians in the government caucus. Maybe if you had defeated David MacDonald and had 4.5 years of seniority, it would have been different. I don't know.
Yeah, it might have been. You're right. No, that's a lot of people said that for sure.
Yeah, sure. Well, you're similar to Dr. Mark McGregor, and of course spent many years on backbenches because there was already two Windsorites in cabinet before Mr. Trudeau appointed him Foreign Affairs Minister.
Yeah.
And he would be a much better Prime Minister than if he had run the leadership too, I think. But regardless of that, my question is, because you were appointed cabinet late, you never had an opportunity to serve as Minister of Justice and Attorney General, which I assume you would very much have liked to have done. So my question is, if you had been in that position, what important changes do you think you may have made to the laws of Canada? You would have liked to have had the job.
Thank you.
Yeah, no, that's a very tricky question. I'm not sure that I would have perceived myself as being a good attorney general. I never was, a scholar of the law to the way Irwin was, or Alan Rock, for example, who I was much more familiar and much more comfortable in the international domain, so in a way I was much, if you'd said to me, do you want to be foreign minister or justice minister, I would have said foreign minister, not justice minister. I wouldn't have said defense minister, but I ended up being defense minister and loving it. So the whole thing is, you never know exactly. But I don't think I can give you a good answer on what laws I would have liked to have seen changed. There were so many legal challenges. I suppose really the thing that the great challenge, as I said, as I watched in the House of Commons on a philosophical basis, the biggest challenge was the relationship between the political framework and the judicial and charter framework around the human rights issues and gay and lesbian peoples and respect for diversity and things like that. And that is very difficult because those issues raise very deep emotional reactions in people. And in fact, in the justice portfolio, quite often you're dealing with issues that have the most visceral and emotional relationship to people and their relationship to the state. So it's a tough one. And I think I used to say in the House of Commons, because the Reform Party guys would say, Parliament's law, what Parliament rules here? I'd say, no, Parliament doesn't rule. We're no longer a parliamentary democracy. We're a constitutional democracy where Parliament has surrendered part of its authority to the Charter to say what is right and what is wrong, and we have to allow the courts to interpret that for us, and we have to accept that. But a lot of politicians don't want to accept that. So the legal issues in our country are so different now than when I went to law school. Before the Charter, questions of constitutional law in Canada were all about 91 and 92, which section is it, provincial rights or federal rights. Now it's about human rights and the development of the Charter. And these are very, very profound issues that we have to deal with. They're very interesting.
I think also your parliamentary career also coincided with a huge renegotiation of the relationship between the political and the legal spheres because of the Charter.
And that created a lot of blowback in some quarters. To some extent, the Reform Party was a blowback against that. And I think we're seeing in the United States today some blowback, from these types of constraints and changes that people are not comfortable with in the present political situation that's prevailing down there.
Mr. Graham, you spoke about how minority governments are ineffective for the Canadian people and how the government is in survival mode and really not a lot gets done. And that certainly in the last several governments, we've seen the minority governments that we've had, that's been the case. But in the Pearson era, it seemed that minority governments were working. So why? And why not now? Why did it work then and why not now?
That the Pearson model is often cited as the one where minority governments work. I think that there is in today's politics a lack of collegiality and respect for one another amongst the opposition and the government that there was at that time. And it's not just in our country. It's in the United States. When I go down there and I talk to my congressional and Senate friends, they said, in the old days, senators came and the House members would come. They'd be there. They'd come on Monday. They'd stay till Friday. They'd have dinner with one another, talk to one another, make deals, respected one another. And now everybody comes in on Tuesday mornings. They go to fundraisers and everything. They leave Thursday morning, go back to their constituency. Nobody talks to anybody. And the Republicans won't lunch with the Democrats and everything else. To some extent, that when the Reform Party was elected in Canada, it was guerre à l'outrance. The Reform Party came in and they said, the Liberals are evil. We won't have any truck with them. They're hopeless people. We won't go to the parliamentary restaurant. We won't go to international meetings. We will when I was trying to go to international meetings, very important international meetings for this country, I was not able to travel in the minority government days because the opposition would not pair and would not allow travel to take place. Now, that was not done in Pearson's day. Pearson's day, the foreign minister and the defense minister had to go to an international conference. That was it, because they knew that one day they'd be in government and you'd have to do the same thing. So why did minority government work in Pearson's time? Because we had a different mindset amongst the people that were there that said, let's make it work. If the politicians that are elected are there to wrecking ball it and not make it work, it's not going to work. And that at least was my experience at our time. That was that. Let's hope we can go back to a more civilized time where we respect one another.
So now I'm just keeping an eye on our time because you have to sell some books.
Well, let's not say sell some books. Let's say I want to share with all the people here what's in them.
So I see quite a few questions. Can I urge people to keep their questions relatively brief, and may I ask the Chancellor the same of his reply?
Oh dear.
And we'll try. So we'll try to get through the questions that we still have left.
We've got to go,
Thank you.
Hello, Mr. Graham. So last year, as we all know, the Liberals came to power on a huge wave, and Trudeau very quickly proclaimed that in the world of international relations, Canada was back. A lot of people in the media have criticized the way that we've come back as more tone than substance, and that's probably unfair because it's been so little time and there hasn't really been much time to change things. But in terms of the substance of Canadian foreign policy, how do you expect that we are going to be back, and how do you expect that we'll shift away from the toxic policies under Stephen Harper?
Well, it's not. I won't pick up on toxic, but David Mulroney, who was a diplomat under the last former government, a very brilliant diplomat, and is presently the president of St. Michael's College, is a brilliant man and a wonderful person, sat here and described at a panel we had of the foreign policy of Mr. Harper's was not a foreign policy, it was a policy of relations with governments that had similar ideological relations with his government. So we liked Mr. Howard we liked Mr. Netanyahu, we liked so-and-so, but we didn't like anybody else, etc. That's not my idea of foreign policy. That's not the foreign policy of this government. This government is, the world is out there. There are people you like and people you don't like, your allies and not your allies, but all of them have to be dealt with. As Shimon Peres said to me one day, you don't make peace by talking to your friends, you make peace by talking to your enemies. If you're not going to talk to people, this is craziness. So that's the first thing that's going to be a substantial difference. And Canada will be active in working with people even if we don't agree with them or like them. because we're going to have to help. We're going to have to live with them. They're on that, and that's people complain about the UN being useless and everything else. I say, yeah, the UN's got a lot of problems, but it brings everybody together. It's the only place that convenes everybody in the world. And we may not like it because there's stuff there that we don't like, but by golly, we better have an institution where we can meet with those people or we're going to be in real trouble. So I think that's where that's more than tone, that is quite substance to reach out to that. So we're going to see some changes along that line, and I think they'll be positive, but there'll be challenges. I mean, I come back to climate change. The present government is saying we're going to do this, do that. The domestic challenges of actually achieving it is going to be a lot more difficult than anybody thinks about it. But anyway.
Dr. Graham, you kind of answered the question I guess I was going to ask, was let me repeat again. You've commented about Iraq, you talked about multilateralism, Canada's role in the UN, and I know in your past speeches you've commented the importance of middle powers such as Canada, not only to support multilateral organizations, the UN, but to make sure that they are operating in an efficient manner where perhaps the superpowers may not rely on the multilateral organizations, but the importance for middle powers such as Canada to support the multilateralism. I'm wondering if you can comment just a bit more on that.
Well, let me give you, I don't think it's just in the interests of middle powers like Canada. Obviously, we prefer legal diplomacy or to power diplomacy because we don't have the power, particularly when it comes to a great neighbor like the United States. But Bill Clinton had a wonderful thing to say one time. He said, we can either live in a world where we're the top dog and we're going to push everybody else around to do what we want to do, and recognize that one day there's going to be a new top dog that's going to push us around. Or we can live in a world where we create rules and a framework in which everybody gets a fair chance. And when we're no longer the top dog, we'll be grateful for that world. So everybody benefits, in my view, from a world that is governed by diplomacy and rules rather than by power.
Mr. Graham, I was really intrigued by your comments about the strengthening of the regime of law, international law, and your reference to making it binding by legislation. But I need to ask, are you not concerned that that trend may have peaked in basically the decade before Russia kicked the whole thing over in the first half of 2014?
Well, certainly, Crimea has been a terrible challenge to the basic principle of the protection of sovereignty. There's no question about it, and it's clear that the Soviet Union under Mr. Putin doesn't intend to play by the rules. But we've gone through periods before where this has happened, and we have to recognize the limits of international law. I'm not saying that it's always going to prevail, but we go through cycles, and I think as Canadians we have to keep working on the cycle, that we have to keep working on making sure the rules ultimately will prevail. The alternative is a totally unconstrained world where it's going to be very difficult for us to operate, no question.
Mr. Graham, my question refers back to one of the points that you said you were quite proud of, and that was that Canada, didn't partner with Britain and the U.S. in the invasion of Iraq in 2003. Now, I heard your interview on CBC's The Current, and between what I heard there and what I heard tonight, I get the impression that there were two main arguments why that decision was made. And here you talked about international law and, that there wasn't a clear mandate from the Security Council. Right. And in the interview on the radio, I heard you speak in this much more sort of commonsensical way that you and your colleagues looked at what the Americans and the British were getting into and were kind of appalled. And so my question is just whether you could talk about the weight of these two different arguments to not engage, and whether one was stronger or were they equal?
I would say, I mean, Mayo asked me the question of the legal, so we ended up in a legal sort of perception of it. But I totally agree with you. Ultimately, it was much more a political decision. And I mean, to be honest, on the politics side, we were facing within 3 or 4 months of that decision, there was going to be an election in Quebec. And I would put it to you that if we'd gone the other way, the Bloc Québécois might have won that election, and we might have had a referendum very quickly on and away, and we might have lost that referendum in the heat of the moment over that issue. So there were a lot of political threads behind Mr. Chrétien's reasoning for doing what he did. And I remember Colin criticized me when I said that the people of Canada were not supported, you know, and then when people, they always say, well, you know, when they don't like a decision you made, well, you've got to show leadership. You know, you're failing. You know, I said 90% of the Canadian population thinks this is a goofy idea. Well, what's the matter with you? You show some leadership and, you know, bring them around. You know, but my answer to Colin was, you know, if 80% of our population don't think it's a good idea, I don't think it's a good idea to take your country into war when most of the people think it's a dumb idea. And we couldn't persuade them. So, of course, there was so much more than the legal issues. In fact, I would put it to you that, you know, in these large discussions around most of these issues, the legal consideration tends to be the last thing that people talk about. It's more the politics first, and then you kind of close it with the legal consideration, if I could say it that way. So I think your question's a very good one, because we don't want to get too romantic about this.
A reception outside. You know that there are more copies of this wonderful book, but Mr. Chancellor, I just want to thank you on our collective behalf. It's a great privilege to have a conversation with a great chancellor, a great internationalist, and a truly great Canadian.
Well, thank you.